One thing I may need to clear up is that when we speak of ball games back in those days, ball games were just local ball games, what went on in our school, because most people didn't have much transportation to go anywhere else. You just stayed right there in your local community because you walked to the school or you rode the school bus. And everybody was within a mile or a mile and a half of the school, and so that's the way it was. Everywhere you went, you walked, or if you had a car, or you could hitch a ride with someone. It was very local in nature. The other thing, when we at home, our Christmas at home was very limited because everybody was very poor in those days. And as a little child, before I went to school, times were tough. I was born during the Dust Bowl days, and my older brothers and sisters lived in the Dust Bowl days. And Dust Bowl was tough. It was Depression time and tough, and there was little or no money. And if we hadn't lived on an acreage where we could raise crops and raise cattle and raise pigs, we would have been as hard up for food as everybody else. But we were of the fortunate few who always had something to eat because we had chickens, we had meat, we had milk and butter. We were very fortunate. We had land, we could raise a garden. Mother always canned every year, and we were very fortunate to be able to eat. The thing we had to buy was flour and salt and sugar. And we managed to be able to sell enough chickens or sell enough pigs that we could do that, or enough wheat that we could do that. And Mother used to talk about that. She used to take 25 cents and buy enough flour and sugar and salt to last for 3 weeks. And that seems impossible in this day and age, but money went a lot farther in those days than it does today. And Mother made all of our bread. She baked everything from scratch. It was an amazing thing. And they talk about polenta today on the cooking channel. They're always talking about polenta. Well, polenta, when I was growing up, was called cornmeal mush. And that was the staple you ate when there wasn't anything else, because that was cornmeal and water is all it was. And you added a little sugar and milk to it, and you ate it. And it was food. It filled up all those holes in your gut that was hungry, and it filled it up and put you to bed, and you slept all night.
I hate to interrupt you, but I've got to ask this. Do you remember being hungry as a child?
No. I remember very little hunger because my mother was magical at making food stretch, like the cornmeal mush. She would stir that cornmeal into that water and make that cornmeal mush, and we'd have mush and milk for supper. And then she'd have the leftovers set out, and it would set up and get firm overnight. And in the morning she'd slice it and fry it in a skillet, and we'd put syrup on it and eat it, and it was marvelous. Mm-hmm. And we'd have eggs. We always had eggs. We always had milk. It was marvelous the way she could stretch food. And I spoke to Retha today, and Retha's 86 now, soon going to be 87. And she made that remark to me today. She said, the one thing Mother could do was she was a miracle worker stretching food. And she said, one time I asked Mother how she managed. She said, after I was married, she said, I asked her how she managed to always make the food stretch, always make food reach, that we never seemed to go hungry. And she said, well, Retha, she said, I told God, she said, I'd get up every morning and I'd pray. And she'd say, Lord, you gave me all these kids. I have to feed them. Now you've got to help me do that. And she said, somehow there'd be enough food show up that I could feed them.
Wow, what a story.
And she said, that's just the way it is. And she said, Mother was a devout believer, and she was a miracle worker. There's no doubt about it when it came to food. But there were lots of times we didn't have any extra. But she said, you know, in the days of the Depression, there were always hobos. And hobos were those people who rode the rails. And the railroad tracks split our acreage, and it cut through there, and oftentimes they would get off of the rail cars and come up to the house and see if there was any work they could do or whatever, or looking for food. And Mother would never turn them down. She would always feed them. Now, it was usually just bread and butter and eggs was probably all she had to feed them, but she would always feed them something. And, of course, she never let them in the house. She always left them sitting outside. But she always fed them something. And we rarely had any work for them to do, but she would feed them anyway. And one of the other neighbors said to her one time, "Why do you feed them?" And Mother said, "I cannot turn someone away who's hungry. But for the grace of God go I."
Do you actually remember seeing the hobo?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, because I was forbidden to leave the house while they were there, while they were in the yard. I was absolutely not allowed out of the house. Because it was dangerous. Considered dangerous. And in fact of the matter, after I got bigger even, I was not allowed to go near the tracks if there was any danger of a hobo down there. I mean, even as a teenager, I was not allowed to go near the tracks if there was anybody on the tracks that we didn't know who they were, because that was too dangerous to do that.
So lots of hobos even into the 40s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, even after the war, there were. And you had to be very careful. And then you had the rail crews. Now, a lot of the railroad crews you knew, you got acquainted with, and you knew a lot of the people who worked on the railroad, like Basil Manning worked on a railroad crew, and a lot of the people that he knew worked on the railroad crew, and you got acquainted with those people who lived in the area, and they were okay. But for some of those railroad crews that they brought in from out of state that you had no idea who they were, you never went near the railroad track when they were on the railroad cruise, when they were there. And they would park their train car in town, and because we were less than a mile from town, it was just a short hop down to our place. So it was very dangerous for us. And they worked on those bridges. We had a bridge on each end of us. And there was a bridge at each end of us. And that's what those bigger rail crews came to do, was work the bridges. And so it was very dangerous for us when they did that. And the girls always had to stay near the house when that kind of stuff was going on, because it was a dangerous thing. We were very protected by our parents. The girls were very protected. And Thressa Newell lived even closer, and she was also very protected. She and her little sister were very protected. And they lived, their house was just a half a block from the bridge, the one bridge closest to town. And they also were very protected about that. But those were the kinds of things you grew up with, and you just learned to acknowledge that and accept it. And children did what their parents told them to do. You didn't argue with them, you didn't fuss at them, you didn't pitch fits, and you just behaved.
What would happen if you sassed them?
Oh, Mother would have slapped you clear across the room in a heartbeat. She'd have slapped you before you could blink. That was Mother's reaction. Nobody sassed Mother. Even in the classroom, you didn't sass Mother.
What about Grandpa? Did he ever sass?
No, Grandpa was pretty easygoing about that. He'd send you to Mother to be punished. Mother was the disciplinarian. It wasn't Dad. If Dad had to get mad, and then he was out of control. So you didn't ever want to make Dad that mad. Now, he never ever. One time he was going to whip me, and he sent me out to get a stick, and I brought him back in a club. which made him laugh. So by then it was all over. And so I never ever got whipped over that one. I don't even remember now what I did. Probably the worst thing I ever did to him was some lady was there visiting, and Dad loved to visit. And I was sitting on his lap, and I was probably 4 or 5 years old. And he loved to sit in that rocking chair there in the dining room. And well, I sat there, and he always wore those white painter's overalls. I unfastened the straps on his overalls. And when she got up to leave, he stood up like men are supposed to do, and his overalls came down. He was so mad at me, he wanted to kill me.
Oh, no.
Well, I was just a little kid doing what little kids do. It was a buckle. Kids undo buckles, right? And Mother laughed, and that made him madder. Now, they didn't come all the way down. The bib just fell down. That's
goodness.
probably as naughty a thing as I did as a little girl.
Let's take a break.